Hello, this is Bad Vibes. Today's stories are home alone, break-in, creepy people outside your house, and all that good stuff. My favorite type of stories. Please hit that like button if you enjoy, as it really helps out the channel. And sit back, relax, and enjoy. Last night, I took some melatonin to get to sleep early. I have an American bulldog who is scared of everything. So I don't think of her as my protector. I feel that I'm her protector, and I'm fine with that. My boyfriend works late, so she usually barks when she hears the garage open. At 10:55, she starts going crazy. At first, I told her to go back to bed. Then I heard my doorbell go off and excessive knocking. We never use our front door. Not once have we ever entered through our front door. We use the garage. My first thought was that my boyfriend's garage opener must be broken or something, but I had no calls or texts from him. My dog was going insane. We live in a gated community, so I don't feel unsafe ever. I go down and my dog is with me. I can't see through the peephole because I'm really short. I heard someone scream, "Help me," and then they started knocking and using the doorbell. I thought it was my boyfriend just playing a trick on me. We have one of those hotel locks on the top of the door, so you can open it 2 inches without really opening it. I unlocked the deadbolt and doorknob and opened it. A man was saying, "Help me," and then started jerking the doorknob. I screamed, "What do you need help with?" He wouldn't speak and kept jerking the doorknob while my dog sounded the meanest I've ever heard. I slammed the door with all my strength and locked it back up. I yell, "I'm calling the cops." While on the phone, he's still ringing the doorbell and beating at the door. 911 heard it. I felt bad because I wasn't sure if he was hurt, but why wouldn't they say something when the door was open? Why didn't my dog's bark faze them at all? He was still beating on my door until the cops got there. When they get there, I see them put an elderly man in the back of the car. I found out that it's my neighbor across the street that I've never met before and had barely seen. Apparently he has dementia and got out of his house. I have a feeling of such guilt for calling the police and scaring his wife. I also felt stupid for how scared I was. I watch a lot of crime shows, and my boyfriend has an important job and sometimes isn't home until 4 a.m. So immediately I thought someone was watching me and knew I was home alone. But it was scary, and now I feel dumb and feel like if it was someone to hurt me, I did the wrong thing by opening the door, even though it still had that lock on it. I keep trying to tell myself that I did the right thing, because what was I supposed to do when all I knew that a strange man was at my door, acting erratically and trying to get into my house? I feel bad for his wife, and that the cops made him take an ambulance to the ER to get checked out. Anyways, that's my creepy encounter for 2022, and hopefully for the rest of my life. When I was 11, my family moved to a very rural area in Minnesota in 1990 after living in a city in Wisconsin. We were surrounded by cornfields, and it was about 45 minutes to any larger town or city. I just want to set the scene a little, because as a young kid who was used to the city, it definitely added to the creepy factor at night. What made it even worse at night for me was that a lot of times I was left alone. My mom was a night shift nurse and my dad was a truck driver. I would leave the TV on, playing Nick at Night, so I could fool myself into thinking that my mom was in the living room, watching shows. I would also sleep in their room because it brought me comfort and it was closer to the TV. Some may disapprove of this, but at the time, there wasn't much to do about it. My parents needed to make money, and this is what they chose to do. Anyway, it was like this often, but one weekend my dad was home, which doesn't happen much. So this meant I was in my room, which is right near the front door. My dad was in their bedroom, towards the back of the house. We had a Springer Spaniel, who was my best friend, and slept with me often. One night that weekend, I woke up with him not on my side, and could hear what sounded like a dog, my dog, growling and whimpering. I got up, walked to the kitchen right outside my room, and looked towards the front door. In the entryway, I saw the head of a man bent down near my dog, and I said, "Hello?" Not sure what the hell I was thinking as a young girl. I should have ran to my dad, but I was worried about my dog, I guess. He stood up, looking startled. I don't remember what he looked like very well, but he was probably in his 40s or 50s, short and looked a little disheveled. He asked me where the nearby town was, and I told him that I didn't know, but I could get my dad. The man had taken a few steps forward, and my dog growled. He then said that he would figure it out and walked out the door. I ran to get my dad, and needless to say, my dad was really upset that I didn't come get him right away. The man never came back, that I know of. I don't know if he somehow knew that I was usually home alone and tried to come in, or if maybe he was drunk and entered the wrong house, thinking it was his. It was definitely pure luck that this strange guy came into my house on a weekend that my dad was home. I know for sure that my dog may have saved me from something awful happening. I still wonder what he was doing bent down that would make my dog whimper like that. I also wonder what would have happened if I had not heard my dog. Anyway, that's my story. It's definitely creepy for me. Some background information, as it's somewhat important. First of all, I'm a female, 5 foot tall, 24 years old at the time, but getting mistaken for a teenager all the time. Baby face, teeny frame. Second of all, I live in Europe, so no guns for me. Enjoy. So this encounter took place a few years ago. I was living in a super huge apartment block, and quite a shitty one. One afternoon, I was just chilling with my then girlfriend when I suddenly heard faint scratching noises outside the door. Definitely weird, but I dismissed it, thinking it's probably some neighborhood kiddos scratching the walls with a key or other stupid stuff kids sometimes do. A moment passed and the noise didn't disappear. Quite the opposite, it got louder. At this point, I started to realize what the sound was. It was the sound of a metal object scratching at my door's lock. I immediately got startled and went to look via the peephole. The long corridor was half dark, and right there in front of my door, there was a man. I couldn't see his face too clearly, but I was 100% sure I did not know him. He was tinkering with the lock in some way, but with the peephole's limited field of view, I couldn't see exactly what he was doing. I made sure all the doors are locked and backed off as it fell silent. Just as I was about to return to the living room, the door handle slowly moved down, and just as slowly returned to its initial position. I goddamn freaked. I hurried to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife, and had squatted next to the door. It was locked, but if he managed to pick it, well, there I was, frightened and armed. For a moment, it fell silent again. Then, the lever slowly went down and up again. More scratching, and the lever moving again. Then silence again. And then, I hear a whisper, "Let me in." My heart skipped a bit, or a dozen of them probably. Let me in. If he was screaming, it would be as frightening, but he wasn't. He was whispering to my door repeatedly, "Let me in." I think I unfroze for a second because I grabbed my phone and called the security. The apartment block had the security, but they were stationed on a small booth outside the block itself, which was huge. I lived on the 8th floor, so it was really long distance to get there, especially given that they were lazy bastards who usually watch TV and smoke so much that there was heavy fog inside the booth. Still, I gave them a panic call, quickly explained the situation. Sure enough, the guards laughed it off, saying that the stranger is probably just some drunk neighbor. He told me that the other guard is on patrol and that he'll call him and tell him to come to my door. I have no idea why I didn't call the police, but I probably was just too frightened to think straight. The block was in the middle of nowhere, so the nearest police station was quite far away anyways. My girlfriend just kept observing, probably some kind of stress reaction too. Seconds felt like hours. After some time, it fell silent, this time for good. 15 minutes later, the freaking security guard finally knocked on my door, long after the guy was gone. Good job, man, seriously. Take your sweet time. Thank you very much." He said that he would close the gate and check the camera footage, but he didn't look too tense, so I don't know if he actually did that. To this day, I have no idea what happened. Maybe it was some drunk neighbor who left the elevator one floor too early or too late and thought his wife had locked him out. Maybe it was some fucking psycho or a junkie trying to purposely access my door. I'll never know. I guess I prefer it that way. Growing up as a teenager, it was just me and my mom that lived together. An important part of the story is the fact that our house was in the country, about 40 miles away from the big city we lived close to. When I started high school, I went to a private high school in the big city, and my mom also worked in that city. For convenience, my mom bought a house in the city near my school and her work, but we kept the country house for the weekends. It's also critical to know that this country house was in some fancy pants gated, secured, and patrolled neighborhood. It was a 2-story house, and we never went upstairs. The upstairs was an informal living room, a bar, a bathroom, and a game room. There just wasn't really any reason to go up there. Also, the downstairs dining room and formal living room were absolutely 100% off limits. I was never allowed to walk in there or go there unless it was a hosted dinner like Christmas or Thanksgiving. It was oddly kept like a museum. I never really moved into the city house. I kept all my clothes and belongings in our country house because we had all of our animals at the country house. I would drive home every day after school to do my homework, feed the animals, watch TV, and do shit around the house. After my homework was done, I would pack an overnight bag of clothes for the next day at school. Then I would drive to the city house. We did, however, spend all of our weekends back at home at our country house. One day I came home after school and I'm putzing around the house. I finished my homework and animal duties, and I go to pack my bag for the next day at school. My dresser drawers were really messed up and things weren't really folded. It looked as if someone had been rummaging through my clothes. I honestly thought I must have messed it up the last time I had packed clothes. I go to leave the house, and there's a crystal bowl turned upside down on the living room tables. I'm honestly shocked I even noticed, but I did because everything in that room was kept in museum quality. I thought it was odd, but didn't think much more of it, and left to the city house. The next day, I'm back at the country house after school and finished my homework and animal duties. This time, my closet seemed a bit in disarray. At this point, I think, holy shit, my mom came home in the middle of the day to see if I had drugs or something in my room? Which I didn't. I wasn't into anything like that. However, when I was leaving the house, I noticed there was a second crystal bowl turned over right next to the first one, so this definitely stood out to me. I went into the room and completely surveyed it. Yes, for a fact, there were only 2 bowls turned over upside down. I drove to the city house and asked my mom if she went through my room. She denies it and asked me, "Do you think someone has been in our house?" I say no because, well, nothing was missing. Plus, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, it's in a gated, patrolled, and secure neighborhood. The third day, I go to school, and a girl a year younger than me at my private high school actually lives directly across the street from my country house. On the off chance we ever stayed the weeknight there, I'd always drive her to school with me. She comes up to me and says, "We saw you leaving your driveway this morning. We flashed our lights at you, but it was foggy, so I guess you didn't see us." At this point, I'm definitely thinking it's my mom going through my room because my mom and I, at the time, drove matching white Mercedes. So I'm thinking my neighbor saw my mom's car leaving. I drive to the country house after school. Again, I walk in and immediately see a third bowl turned over. Chills cover my entire body. I'm walking into my room, bedsheet stripped, pillowcase gone. So many things from my bookshelf were missing. It was completely ransacked. I immediately ran outside of the house and called my mom and then the police. When the police showed up, my mom, who was driving to the house but still on the phone with me, asked me to go into her bedroom closet and look under the stack of jeans on the highest shelf. There was nothing there. It's apparently one of the 3 places my mom kept her jewelry. She started sobbing. She asked me to check under her underwear in her drawer. No jewelry there. She then asked me to check under her winter sweaters. Nothing there. She is hysterical at this point. She also asked me to check under the stove. Again, nothing. That's where she kept a heavy wooden box of silverware her parents brought over from Sweden when they moved to America. Everything that was considered valuable or heritage was completely gone. Every last thing. All of it. The security gate had 0 unauthorized visitors on their cameras and no other white Mercedes. The police did a full sweep of the house and identified a space in the upstairs game room where someone had apparently been living. There were also soda cans in the attic space that is accessed through a small door in the upstairs bar. Apparently, I had been coming home as a 16-year-old while someone or multiple people were living in our upstairs space and had been doing a full scope of the house and all the assets to steal. To add insult to injury, my mother died unexpectedly about 3 weeks after the robbery happened. The insurance claim my father had to make, who was entirely out of the picture, turned out to be $480,000. Now the worst part, I'm 16 years old. Remember how my neighbor saw a white Mercedes coming out of our driveway? The local police in a very small town that this county house was in tried to charge me with robbery and insurance fraud, assuming that I had took all the stuff from our house. It only lasted about 2 weeks, but was intensely brutal. I cried pretty much nonstop. It was unending tears. My mother had just died, and I was working with my lawyers to fight for my innocence. A few years back, I moved to a relatively remote part of town with my boyfriend. We owned a small section of land behind our home, which consisted of woods, a creek, and general shrubbery. I would take my dogs out there every day for walks, and one day came across what looked like a campsite where a homeless person would live. There was a basket full of sticks and what I assumed was being used for firewood. There was a mattress, blankets, and tarps. It looked relatively kept, so I assumed someone must have been actively staying there. I went off in a different direction and decided to stay away from that area. I told my boyfriend what I had came across that day, and we were trying to figure out what we should do to eventually remove the person, as this was our land and we didn't feel comfortable having someone camping out so close to our home. We sort of forget about it for a few months until one day I'm walking past that area again with my dogs and curiosity got the best of me, so I went to have a snoop. Once again, I found the same layout. There were some leftover food items and the remainder of a fire. I quickly left. That same night, as I was waiting for my boyfriend to get home, I was in the kitchen cooking and facing the window that looked outside towards the woods. That's when I thought I saw someone standing next to a tree, but it was so dark out and I have horrible eyesight, so I didn't try to overthink it. But then I actually started overthinking. Our home and property was fenced, and then about that little campsite I saw again today. I freaked myself out. Could that be the person that was staying there? I knew someone probably was, but didn't think that they would show themselves, if that makes sense. I carried on cooking and thinking on it, hyping myself up in a bad way. I kept looking around but couldn't see anyone, so I hoped it was just my anxiety and my overthinking. And that's when there was a knock on the back door. We had curtains covering the window on that door, so I couldn't see who was knocking, and I wouldn't be able to see from the window I was standing at either. I went to the door, moved the curtain. No one was there. The dog started barking at this point, which if you have dogs, you know that when you are feeling anxious, them barking can freak you out even more. I was playing music and turned it off so I could hear better. The dogs were barking in the front room at the window, but I couldn't see anything. I shut the curtains fully, then calmed down the dogs, but I was feeling very, very uneasy. Suddenly, a noise came from the kitchen, like someone was jumping against the door. The dogs started going crazy again and ran into the kitchen. I went after them. The door kept jittering and moving. Someone was trying to get in. The pole that was holding up the curtain fell, and I saw the man wearing what looked like a white face mask, some sort of cover to conceal his face. He kept pushing on the door. I was hyperventilating at that point. If I left out the front door, he could run and get me in seconds. So I left the dogs downstairs and ran upstairs, locking myself in the bathroom. I felt so scared, and I was so scared for my dogs. I called the police and I could hear the back door keep being hit, and the dogs barking so loudly. I remember how I haven't even been able to tell the police my address before the noises stopped, and I could just hear the barking, but no more bashing sounds. I was momentarily convinced that he had gotten in, but surely I would be able to hear some sort of struggle. My dogs were 2 large German shepherds, yet I could hear nothing. The police arrived very soon after, and my back door was still intact. I spoke with them through the bathroom window as I was too scared to come down before they assessed the house from the outside. I had to calm the dogs down before I let them in, as the dogs were very riled up. I told the police about the homeless person who lived in the woods. They had a look in the area and couldn't seem to find anyone or anything suspicious. That was until a few weeks later when myself and my partner, along with our dogs, walked down to the campsite again to see if it had been abandoned or not, on the slim chance that they did have something to do with the break-in. And we found this, the white mask I spoke about before. How I couldn't tell what it was. It was hanging on this tree. Gloves and boots were hidden in a bag, which was found by the creek, soaking wet. Apparently, all this wasn't there when the police had went down there that night, though the campsite, for the first time, definitely looked abandoned. We sent pictures to the police, who came down again soon after, but even though they had all the evidence, safe to say nothing was ever done about it, most likely as there was no successful break-in. We got everything removed from the campsite and taken away. Who knows what would have happened if the back door had given in. I still worry thinking about it. It's left me with a lot more unresolved anxiety than I ever had. For a bit of context, I'm a single female in my 30s and live alone, apart from my pets. I'm on my own when it comes to my safety. So this happened last summer. It was around 11 p.m. and I was sitting at my dinner table typing away on my final paper for the semester. Behind me sits my kitchen and a big window that overlooks my backyard. The backyard is surrounded completely by a 6-foot vinyl privacy fence, and inside that fence was a little garden that I had been working really hard on. Lots of cute flowers and a little pond. I was proud of it and would leave the blinds open so I could take in all my hard work during the day. I was caught up in my paper that was due by midnight, and since it was late, the dogs were snoozing away nearby. My concentration was broken by a very sudden, very loud, and a very deliberate behind me. I froze completely, and it dawned on me that I never closed my blinds. All my interior lights were on, and we know how that works. Whoever was tapping could see me perfectly. Weirdly and inconveniently enough, my dogs who would normally bark at the slightest noise were still sound asleep. It took me about 5 minutes to muster the slightest ounce of courage to turn my head just enough to see my window and my peripheral, only to hear a loud crunch and another couple taps. Just a bit lighter. Nope, fuck that. No need to look. The last thing I need to see is a face pressed up against the window. To my left was a door to my carport, which led to the backyard. The handle was within arm's reach, and I wouldn't have to look at the window to open it. I called my dogs and they jumped up as soon as I turned the knob. I guess the watcher realized what I did. About 30 seconds passed and I heard a couple more crunches. Then a very loud thud. If you've ever heard a vinyl fence being smacked against, it's a bit distinctive, and I knew that they had jumped it. My dogs finally went nuts and ran to the window near the thud. Lights were off and blinds were closed, thankfully. I caught a quick glimpse of a leg disappearing behind the corner of my neighbor's house. I stayed up until dawn with my metal baseball bat and one of those giant sharp grill forks. With the fence on my dogs, I always felt safe. How did they get there so quietly? I'll never know. I've lived here my whole life and have never had anything happen, so this has shaken me. whoever that was wanted me to know that they were there and definitely wanted my attention. I've since installed multiple cameras and motion lights all around the perimeter of my house. It's been quiet since. I feel better, but the illusion of safety has all but disappeared. I live alone in an apartment in Utah. My area is fairly metropolitan, and it's not uncommon to see unhoused people near my building. Since I'm a single woman, I'm usually more cautious about locking my doors and setting alarms than my friends with roommates. I have a Simply Safe alarm system and also have 2 deadbolt locks on my door. Because my area has a lot of break-ins, I'm also sure to always lock everything, no matter what. 2 nights ago, I come home late from a night out with my friends, but I was sober. I made sure to lock everything and set the alarm like usual. When I woke up the next morning, I heard someone in my house. They were wearing shoes and just walking around. One of my friends has a code to my alarm, but none of my friends have a key. I'm the only person I know with a key to the second deadbolt on my door, not even my landlord. I lean my head out the door of my bedroom, which is just a few feet from the more open living room kitchen area where the sound was coming from. There was a man in my kitchen, and maybe 40 years old. He was wearing a full suit and tie, but seemed really tired or drunk. He was standing by my fridge and eating leftovers out of a Tupperware and just kind of staring off. I ducked back into my room and called 911. For the next 10 minutes, I stood by my bedroom door and listened to this man eat a bunch of food from my fridge. When he was done with something, he would just drop the container onto the floor. When the police showed up, both deadbolts were still locked. They knocked on the door, and the man in my apartment answered. The police rushed him and yelled if I was okay. When I came out of my bedroom, they had the man pinned down on the floor, and I saw that he had rearranged the furniture in my living room. There were containers all over my floor. The man wasn't saying anything, and he never said anything, even when the police were asking him questions. After they took him away, the officer told me that the man had a business card in his wallet, and he works at a bank downtown. The weirdest thing is that my alarm was set and my deadbolts were locked from the inside, even when he was in my apartment. None of the windows were unlocked, and I'm on the 4th floor. I have no idea how he got in. Update. I have been back and forth with correspondence with the lead investigator, and we finally were able to talk Thursday about exactly what happened concerning the man who broke in. I will call him Jake for the sake of clarity. On Tuesday of this week, the lead investigator of my case, Nelson, emailed me with this message, among other things. Don't let anyone wearing a hard hat into your apartment. I called him and asked if I could meet with him, but he said that he was busy with some cases and would only be able to meet me on Thursday of this past week. We emailed back and forth late Tuesday night and into Wednesday. I would email him back immediately, but sometimes it would take a few hours to respond. In one of his follow-up emails, he told me that the man who had gotten into my house never worked for the bank in town, and they had tracked the business cards to another person entirely. Additionally, the man who broke into my house is unable to speak. On Wednesday night, all the tenants in my building received a message that light construction work would be ongoing for the next few days to repair wiring and plumbing. I told my landlord in a message back that the investigator into my case had requested me to deny access to any person wearing a hard hat. My landlord told me that there would be no reason for a construction crew to enter my apartment, as all the work they were doing was in the community access breaker box and the basement beneath the building. A few hours later, I get a knock on my door. It was around 10:15 p.m. When I looked through the peephole, there was a man in a denim jumpsuit standing outside my door. He wasn't wearing a hard hat, but he had on a tool belt and appeared to be some kind of construction worker. I asked him what he needed, and he said that he needed to come check my pipes in my bathroom. I asked him why he would be doing this at 10:15 p.m., and he said that he was trying to get to all the rooms while the water was already turned off. I asked him if he could contact my landlord on speakerphone, so I knew he was legit, and instead of complying, he grew angry and told me that he was just doing his job. I told him that he wasn't allowed to come into my apartment and I would not be opening it for him. I then stepped back into my bedroom and phoned Nelson. He didn't respond, but I left him a message. I then called 911 and informed them of my situation, asking if they could come by and check on the workers. The dispatcher told me that she would send someone to my building. I then called my landlord and told her that someone was trying to get into my apartment in a construction outfit. She told me that they had left several hours before. I went back to the door and looked through the peephole, and of course, he was gone. When the police showed up about 20 minutes later, they couldn't find the man anywhere in the building. However, in the video of our entrance near the mailboxes, the man was seen entering the building around 10 p.m. Early the next morning, Thursday, Nelson called me to ask if I could meet him at the police station. When I got there, Nelson walked me back to his office. He had an iPad on his desk and a plastic 3-ring binder, like I used to use in school. I kinda hoped for the classic manila folder, but oh well. He opened the binder and flipped through some pages before settling and looking at me. Nelson then told me that the man that got into my apartment was named Jake, and that he is unable to speak, but is fluent in ASL. He can hear perfectly fine, and he typically carries a notebook with him to write in for people that cannot sign. Nelson then told me how Jake got into my apartment and what the deal with the construction worker was. Jake went missing in mid-December. He works for the Nevada Department of Transportation until December of last year. Jake was a fairly respected family man. In his teens, he had been addicted to drugs, but he had kicked the habit and started working for the Department of Transportation. In the next couple of decades, Jake got married, had a child, and lived fairly comfortably. However, he had a relapse in December for unknown reasons, and soon after that, he had disappeared. There are videos of him acting strangely at gas stations, where he had used his credit card in the days after his disappearance, but then he stopped using his cards after that. There's a 2-week period where they're not sure what happened with Jake. The next time Jake popped up, it was in Utah, where I live, and he was cited for a minor vehicle infraction. The next time I saw Jake, it was in my apartment. After they took him into the station, they had a long conversation with him where they would talk, he would write, and they would talk again. Jake failed to make sense to the investigators. He wrote about being hungry and not being able to sleep. When they asked him how he got into my apartment, he would write about how he didn't need any help. Eventually, Nelson was able to get the story from Jake. During his first weeks in Utah, Jake had started going to bars and meeting some blue-collar workers in the area. He had got onto a road construction job from his past DOT experience and met another drug addict named Patrick. He and Patrick both use hard drugs. Patrick has been known to get into apartments by posing as a construction worker, and that he sells stolen goods from apartments to pay for his habit. The night Jake got into my apartment, he was wearing a suit. His method for breaking in was to look nice enough that someone would just let him through the entrance. After that, he would either enter an unlocked apartment, step out of their window, and then come through a neighbor's window. Apparently, one of my windows has a broken latch and cannot be properly locked. I also don't have any sensors on my windows, so that explains why the alarms never went off. When Jake had entered my apartment, he had already been through several other apartments. He was high while he was doing this, and he was hungry after several hours of sneaking around, so he went into my fridge and started to eat. As Nelson understands it, Jake became drunk by just going through my fridge and eating and drinking. He also said the original owner of the business card lives in my building, and Jake had stolen the business card case from the entrance of the man's apartment. Nelson said Patrick would likely try to hit the same apartments as Jake at some point, so it didn't surprise him that Patrick showed up at my apartment not long after Jake did. Nelson said that he'll be contacting me eventually for the trial, and that it might be a good idea to intensify security in my apartment until they catch Patrick. So my therapist insisted that I tell this to stop being scared and mad at it. The being pissed off at this memory doesn't have anything to do with the story, so I won't really be telling it. Back in late 2020, it was probably around fall, maybe September. I was living in what is called a host home. Basically, someone or a person lets you live in their house while you try to build a better future for yourself. I was left alone one night when I heard creaking upstairs. I get creeped out easily, so I kept having to brush it off, but everything was heightened in fear because I'm basically blind. My glasses were broken and I was waiting for new ones in the mall. I was sitting on my computer doing schoolwork or something when I heard footsteps outside. I was slightly freaking out, so I called my friend to talk with me. I kept telling myself it was a cat or small animal that kept coming around the property. Well, while I was on the phone, the back door light flashed on. It was a movement sensor. So I turned around and saw this thing on all fours staring at me. I flipped out because it looked like a blurry, naked human to me. My friend heard me yell and kept yelling for me to call the cops. I ended up calling the cops and they did find footsteps on some of the mud, but concluded it might have been there before, as the owners frequently did gardening. I told them everything I knew, and they stated that it was a good thing I called. Better to be safe than sorry. Nothing was found on the cameras, but a week later, some guy was found high in the park nearby, completely naked and bald, just like the thing I saw. About 3 years ago, I lived in a first floor apartment in a considerably safe area. At the time, I worked during the day, and then my husband worked at nights. On this particular night, I was staying up pretty late while my husband was at work. For reference, my apartment has a small patio that is gated off, and my couch is adjacent to the window that looks out over the patio. I was sitting on the couch watching a show when I heard a sort of rustling outside the window. For some reason I thought my husband had gotten off early and was trying to fuck with me. He never did anything like that, so I wanted to see how it would play out. But as I waited, nothing happened. Confused, I texted him, "Is that you outside?" To my shock, he replied, "What are you talking about? I'm still at work." Horrified, I jumped up and slowly lifted the blinds just enough to peek through. But fortunately, there was nothing. I ran through every room in my apartment, peeking through the window to see if I could find anyone or anything that could be making that noise. Again, nothing. So I mustered up the courage to open up the patio door quickly, flipping on the lights. There was absolutely nothing outside, no evidence of someone getting onto my patio. I was paranoid the whole night, but kept telling myself that it was just an animal. Fast forward a couple weeks, my mother comes to visit, and as soon as she came inside, she asked if I knew that my door handle was loose. I was confused by what she meant, so she showed me my front doorknob. It was loose and had scratches all around the keyhole, like someone was trying to jig it open with a screwdriver. It terrifies me to think that someone was trying to break into my home. I really believe whoever tried breaking into my apartment is responsible for making the noises I heard that night. In my early 20s, I was staying with a friend in Northern California, Lake County, Mendocino area. The first night I get into town, my friend picks me up, and we make the trek to his house. As soon as we get there, he gives me the tour. 2-story house, probably 5 bedrooms from what I can remember. As he shows me the guest room in the basement, a look's come over his face. "It looks like it's been ransacked," he says. We talk about it, but he just brushed it off. So I decided to sleep on the couch. He had to drop off his friend at the airport at 5 a.m. the next morning, so I sleep in and wake up to scratching sounds coming from the window. I lay there for a few minutes just listening. It's obviously something at this point. In my boxers, I decide to investigate. That's when I see a figure with a crowbar trying to pry open the kitchen window. There's no landline, and I had no cell phone. The blinds are open, so I have to sneak into my friend's room, which meant I had to go through the kitchen. He had a sliding glass door that opened right onto the 2nd-story balcony where the kitchen window was. I'm looking frantically for anything to defend myself, and notice a samurai sword. So here I am in my underwear with a sword, hiding behind a tapestry he used as curtains for the sliding glass door, sizing this guy up at 8 a.m. That's when I hear the window give and pop open. No choice, I stepped out, ripping open the slider door, sword drawn, ready to go last samurai on this guy. He was so shocked. He must have been watching the house and knew that my friend was gone, but since I had gotten late, he didn't know I was there. He stumbled and fell down the steps, jumping the railing and ran. My friend had flower pots on the railing. I tossed them, nearly hitting him. The only proof I had was that one of the guy's tennis shoes came off in the chaos. This is gonna sound bizarre and made up, but I swear on my left nipple that this happened, and there are several witnesses. Even if I can't explain why someone would do this, I'm fairly positive this isn't anything paranormal. I live quite a distance off the road in an unremarkable house on private property. My neighbors are all older family members who go to bed extremely early and whose children are already grown and out of the house. In summary, there are no mischief makers to play pranks on us here. A few months ago, my mom and I stayed up late one evening watching television together. Around 3 a.m., I turned the television off and decided to go to bed. As I was leaving the room, I began to hear what sounded like carnival music playing outside of my house in the front yard. It was loud and close. My mother heard it too, and immediately went to the window to investigate. She couldn't see anything but darkness. Everyone else was either asleep for the night or away on vacation. The lights were off in all the houses, and none of them would be caught dead listening to anything but country music. We were miles from the nearest city, so it wasn't a product of noise pollution. You could hear when a car pulled up in the yard, but there was no sound of a car. The silence where we live is usually deafening. All you can hear is the ringing in your ears. Where did the song come from? Who was playing it, and why? I was very unsettled by the idea of a stranger in our yard playing carnival music, as it suggests malicious intent. My father and uncle later mentioned that 20 years ago, when my parents first moved in, the electrician had came to install the ceiling light and stopped in the middle of his work, saying he could hear Pink Floyd playing in the front yard. Neither my father or uncle could hear it. My father is a bit hard of hearing, and my uncle is much older, so they laughed it off and thought the man was insane, but the electrician was freaked out. He kept opening the door and trying to find the source of the noise to no avail. Then it hit me, the song that I had heard that night was Pink Floyd's Cirrus Minor, the part that sounds like carnival music. I played the song for my mother, and she began freaking out, saying, Yes, that's what I heard." Who the hell sits in the yard at night at 3 a.m. in the middle of nowhere playing the same song, which isn't even a popular song, 20 years later with no car? Where did they come from? They would have to have walked several miles to get here. Aside from this, the only other strange thing we experienced that would suggest an intruder, we feel and hear knocking on the living room window late at night around the same hour. Sometimes so intense that the entire wall of the house is rattled and it sends the couch against it into reclining position. There are no nearby trees to tap the glass, and no animals, except a human, could possibly reach it. Fortunately, this has stopped over the last few weeks. Update. Shortly after my first post, I had almost convinced myself our intruder was gone. As I was staying up in the early hours of the morning to finish homework, I heard a noise in the yard just outside my bedroom. I sat there listening, but could only detect something like machinery. It was not a sound I recognized. I couldn't imagine what was causing the noise unless the air conditioning was misbehaving. But once it had quieted down, I finished my homework and went to sleep. About 2 nights later, I heard loud grinding around the same hour, but again could not determine the source, however alarming the volume was. The following morning, my father discovered that someone had sabotaged our air conditioning unit by first removing a piece of the inner machinery and later throwing it into the fan while it was spinning. It effectively destroyed the blades and a few other pieces. That part had been presumably taken the first time I was disturbed by the activity in the yard and thrown back in the second time. I had noticed it only because the outdoor unit is mounted against my bedroom. We initially thought that the piece, and forgive me for my ambiguous language as I'm not very tech savvy, had loosened by itself and broken down, but we called our repairman, who begged to differ. He was surprised by the degree of damage and insisted that he had never seen it happen naturally, suspecting that someone had removed a few screws and tampered with the unit. He thought my father had attempted to work on it and caused the trouble, but of course, he had not. A few days after the damaged parts had finally been replaced, my mother was leaving for a doctor's appointment when she began yelling and called the family out to the yard. Our electric box was opened in the night and left ajar, as if someone had been trying to find the wire to cut to disable our electricity and security system. We had been outside several times since the repairman finished his work, and we were certain he closed the electrical box if he had ever opened it. We have weathered several severe hurricanes here, and the winds are not strong enough to open the electric box. A person had to have done it. Weeks passed without incident, my parents opting to overlook these concerning happenings. My father tried to explain the air conditioning as a freak occurrence. They purchased a new gun and did little else. Towards the beginning of summer, my grandfather mentioned that a couple weeks prior, when we were on vacation, he had seen a red Jeep drive the lengthy distance from the road through our private property to the house in broad daylight. He didn't recognize the driver, but approached and questioned him. The man claimed that he was looking for a woman that lived in the trailer. The person he claimed to be looking for had the name of a family friend that lives hours away from us. The man was behaving strangely, and my grandfather was not convinced by his story. He ordered him to leave immediately. Our family that lives around us on the farm is reinforcing their doors, installing extra locks, and keeping their children out of their yards until they find out what's going on. They won't let them walk home from the bus stop anymore. I had stopped worrying over it because I've been preoccupied with moving to a new state, but the old knocking returned this evening at 10 p.m. My parents were watching television together when they heard it. They turned the porch light on and peered out the peephole to investigate, but saw no one. At 3 a.m., I was awake watching TV when it sounded as if someone was forcefully punching the glass of the usual exposed window. I covered it with a blanket, as I always do. An hour after I covered the window, I began hearing loud noises from the back porch off of the kitchen, as if someone had stepped onto it. However, it was briefly lived. They apparently weren't walking around, but simply standing there. About 10 minutes after, I heard yet more knocking, except this time, it wasn't on the exposed living room window, but further down the wall that the window was on, next to the couch. It was 3 knocks, forceful enough to rattle the wall a bit, but not so much that the couch moved. This is more alarming because it suggests that the trespasser lingers here for several hours at a time, posing many more questions. Are we being watched for an opportunity to force entry? Hasn't the opportunity already arisen in the past, and they never took it? Are we being stalked? Do they gather here to drink and get high on our property, and then decide in their stupor that it would be funny to antagonize us? Why is it only our house that is targeted, and not other houses on the farm? Why do they walk several miles to come here? Their behavior is escalating. Will they eventually take things further? I awaked my mother, and we sat awake together until the sun rose to keep watch. We compiled a list of happenings here that suggests our trespasser visits more frequently than they knock. Despite no one in our family smoking, or anyone who does smoke living too far away for us to smell it, we often deal with a strong scent of cigarette around our windows or the front and back doors of our house. This happens at our bedroom window with alarming regularity. Other times, it's a strange cologne or a chemical stench, like a fresh perm. We of course remembered how my aunt's dog will bark intensely at odd hours of the night, like they do when the stranger visits. The motion detecting yard light has previously came on when no one is at home at my grandfather's. My mother and I are going to walk the perimeter of the house in the morning to take a look for cigarette butts and try to convince my father that we at least need security cameras outside. Even though I think we should involve the police at this point, he's been too indifferent to everything that's happened, and it makes it challenging to be proactive about our safety. Last update, despite the insistence of myself and other Redditors, my parents never installed security cameras. My father remained resistant to the idea, most likely because he wasn't willing to admit that something was amiss. In the beginning, he complained about the cost, the possibility of hackers, and the difficulties with mounting a camera. He eventually promised to borrow someone's trail camera, but he never broached the subject with them. I moved to another state, and the need for cameras was no longer at a forefront of my mind. But when I remembered and received my new debit card after some unfortunate identity theft, I offered to pay for one. I told my father that I would personally buy a camera or two and have them delivered. Only then did he confess that he was afraid of seeing something spooky on it. He had a childlike idea that if he never saw anything happening, the problem would resolve itself. Despite all odds, the problem did resolve itself. Not long after I moved out, my grandfather, who lives in a separate house on the same farm, came home to find police cars in his driveway. An officer approached him and asked if he owned another house on the farm, as he needed to speak to the landlord about his tenants. The house in question was occupied by my late relative's widow, who has a lifetime estate. My grandfather explained that the property was part of the farm, which is owned collectively by him and his daughters. Because of this, he was permitted knowledge of what was happening there. The officer explained everything. Apparently the widow, who is quite old and infirm, used the death of my relative as an excuse to move her chronically unemployed, drug-addicted family, among them her daughter, her son-in-law, her son-in-law's brother, and nephew. Because they don't have their own separate cars and we seldom visit the widow, she stinks and is generally unlikable. So we socially distanced around her before the pandemic ever began. The transition went undetected. Shortly before my grandfather had returned home that day, the police responded to a 911 call from the widow. Her nephew is apparently involved in a gang and has violent tendencies. Some conflict arose in the house, probably related to how many drug addicts are stuffed together under a single roof for 24 hours a day. All we were told is that the nephew was becoming violent. When the police arrived, they realized that there was an outstanding warrant for his arrest. He was wanted for making meth and for assault, which commenters on the last post blamed this for the stench we were smelling. My nephew was hiding from the law at the widow's house. This is the reason why his presence was so concealed from us on the rare occasions that the widow was outside of her home and we had spoke. He was removed from the home and arrested by the officers. Ever since then, there has been no strong chemical odors outside, no knocking on the window late at night, and for assault, we suspect that he was aware of the farm long before moving in, and it was a go-to spot for his drug use. We're thinking that he would occasionally spend the night at the widow's house over the years and walk towards a field near us to do drugs. It makes sense that we never heard a car accompanying the knocking noises because he doesn't own a car, and the house is not far since it's part of the farm. The only incident that remains unexplained is the man who drove to our house when we weren't home and asked my grandfather about a family friend who lives an hour away. I wonder if they were looking for the meth head and were told to give some sort of code to make sure he was at the right house. The name could have just been a coincidence. I had an internet incident a few months ago that suggested some stalkerish activity, but it's probably unrelated. I am satisfied with this explanation since there has been no more repeat occurrences after his arrest. This may not be that creepy, and it may just be in my head, but I know what I heard. Yesterday night, about an hour after I finished eating dinner, I heard exactly 3 knocks on my bedroom window. Not like a tree tapping, but like a person using their knuckles or fingers. I went to check outside to see if it was my father, who sometimes forgets his house keys, even though he usually knocks on the front door first and announces who he is. But he wasn't there. Then it happened again a few minutes later. Same as before, 3 quick knocks. My grandmother assumed I was hearing things because we had a snowstorm coming that had canceled school for the next few days. But I had been living in a house my entire life. I know what rats running around in the attic sounds like, or what tree branch tapping sounds like. Then today, I heard it again, exact same as before, the 3 quick knocks. Maybe it's my neighbor playing a stupid prank, but I know what I heard, and it's never happened before. Hopefully it will stop soon. Until then, looking for any thoughts of what I should do to take my mind off of it. Not scared, but just annoyed. So, quite a number of years ago, my cousin and I were on summer break at our house playing 007 on GameCube, and just passing the time, when we heard what sounded like broken glass on tile. The TV was pretty loud, so we paused it, tensely waiting for another sound. Then, we heard the sound of flip-flops walking around the kitchen area. So my cousin called her mom, my aunt. She asked my aunt, who was a nurse, if she had got home from work yet. My aunt was not home and, of course, wanted to know why we were asking. Once we told her, she told us to crawl out the window and run to the neighbors as quickly as we could, while she called the cops. The bedroom window luckily led to the backyard, just next to the gate, so we got the fuck out of there. Fast forward an hour or so, and the cops informed my aunt that there had been an obvious break-in. The window on the back door had been broken, and there was a note left for my aunt. Now, my aunt had recently gotten into a serious relationship with a super nice guy. We'll call him Josh. Well, Josh's ex-wife was not so nice. She had at some point followed my aunt home and found where she lived. She then proceeded to break in through the back door, rummage through a bunch of stuff, and leave a horrible note for my aunt. I can imagine what it said. From what I heard, she was arrested. I'm not sure if any charges were pressed, but later she committed suicide. She left a daughter and a son behind, whom I both went to school with. I later found out that she suffered from severe bipolar disorder and a couple other things. Tragic, but I'm glad me and my cousin weren't caught up in her psychotic episode more than what we were. Still freaks me out to think about. So this takes place around my junior year in high school, back when Slender Man was just getting started. I didn't believe in him at all, until one night my dogs were in the dog run, barking to be let in. Except this time, it sounded like they were mad for some reason, like they were trying to scare something away. So I go into the dog run to let them back in, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this tall ass dude standing at the gate in my backyard. He looked at first glance just like the description. Tall, thin, lanky, no discernible face, since it was dark out. I was legit scared shitless, and the more I look at him, the more I got scared. So I yell at my dogs to come back inside and get to work on putting it out of my mind. Because of course, I imagined it. Slender Man isn't fucking real. Could he be? I never saw the guy or thing again and completely forgot about it until recently. And I realized that it was more likely a guy trying to silence my dogs so he could break in, do God knows what to my family. Of course I know Slender Man isn't real, but I'd almost prefer that, rather than knowing what could have happened if that were a real person. For some background, I live on an island, and my backyard ends in a golf course. I'm 17, female, and live with my mom and 2 dogs. Back in August of 2021, I saw a man. He looked to be in his late 50s or early 60s. He was walking on the golf course, no golf gear, no golf cart, not even in golf attire. All of a sudden, he walks into my backyard, snooping around, looking like he's trying to get the lay of the land. It kept happening for a while, but then stopped for a bit. Then it happened again for a while, and then stopped again until recently I caught him doing it again. When it all first started happening, I thought it was just a golfer retrieving a ball that was hit into my backyard. I quickly realized that that was not the case. Then I thought he must be with the golf course staff, and that wasn't the case either, because he was not wearing a uniform that the staff wears. Sometimes he gets really close to my house, which makes me nervous, as this is a grown man I absolutely do not know and is not a golfer. It's also really off-putting because I'm a minor, living alone with my mom, and he looks like he's scoping out potential places he could enter the house. When I see him, I always make sure to stare at him, making it known that he is not welcome in my yard for any reason, and certainly not in my house. He occasionally catches my stare and quickly walks away, looking very guilty. So I want to start this off by saying that this isn't my personal story, but one of my old substitute teachers. I first heard it around 4 or 5 years ago, but because of my love of creepy things and its mystery, I can't help but remember it. I forget his name, but let's say, Mr. News. Mr. News explained that when he was a kid, maybe 11 or 12 in the 70s, he would deliver newspapers as a way to make simple money. He had a couple houses that he would hit up every trip. But I remember this one was either the first time or the family just didn't get the newspaper much. Anyway, he was biking up to this house that he described as having a huge front and backyard, and he had to walk up their yard a little to throw it closer to their actual deck. While he was walking through, Mr. News heard a bone-chilling scream that sounded like someone was being murdered in front of him. Even though he was terrified as a little boy, he continued to walk until he heard another one, this time way louder. He looked around a little and eventually saw a small opening under the porch that created a mini hole, just big enough for a child to sit in and to see from the outside. He said that there was a kid that sat in this hole, covered in dirt completely head to toe, to the point where he wasn't even sure what their gender was. By their size and voice though, he was sure that the child was around his age. As soon as the poor kid saw him, they let out their hand to reach for him and scream one last time, with their voice apparently breaking a little and sounding super hoarse. Because he was a scared little kid, he ran off without helping them and never told anyone about it until years later. He said that to this day, that is easily one of the biggest regrets in his life. I'm not sure what was going on, but my best bets are either parental abuse or kidnapping. Either way, it's heartbreaking, and I really hope that kid ended up surviving. It was around 2 a.m. My girlfriend and I were awoken by extremely loud banging on the entrance door to our building. We lived on the 3rd floor, as well as our doorbell being rung continuously. Obviously, the banging scared the living hell out of us. After a few breaths, I opened the window and popped my head out to see a woman and a man who is now on the phone by the front door. I yell out, "Hello?" And the girl says she lives here. The week before, we had just seen this new girl leaving the apartment building as we were entering, and as it was night and therefore dark, and I am on the 3rd floor and I had just woken up, I thought it was her. We figured I should go down and open it for her and her boyfriend, since my girlfriend was scared as hell and it's better to be a man in those cases. Anyways, my girlfriend was standing at our door listening in case something was to happen. I opened the door to let them into the teeny hallway, leading straight into the teeny spiral staircase. I move as to let them pass me to make sure they actually lived here, but they don't budge. They stink of alcohol, and the guy looks almost homeless based on his shabbiness as well as the plastic bag hanging from his shoulder. He said that he had just moved into the 1st floor and for some reason he could not open the front door. Also asking if I was Alex, which I am not. The girl, who looked pretty normal, asked me what floor I was staying on. He was fumbling with his keys, trying to get them from inside the door. I asked them if they could enter their apartment. They don't answer. Suddenly, the guy realizes that he's at the wrong address, asking if he's in X address. The girl says she is just with him and did not know, almost laughing about it. The guy becomes very apologetic and kind, and off they go. First thing I thought was that they were drunk and the guy was bringing a girl home and just messed up the address since he had just moved into the new place. Even more so because the address he gave me had a similar door to ours and was right down the road across the street, but the building was not the same at all, so far from it, and they did not seem that drunk. What questions that theory is that the girl said that she lives here, and later on she said she was just with him. Them not wanting to go in front of me, not answering me when I asked if they could enter their own apartment, and then realizing it's the wrong building the second I question them, and when it becomes obvious that I'm not leaving them alone, him looking like he did with his big bag. Looking back, I should have just talked to them from the window or called the police,